The cold was a discipline. For Elias Vance, it was the only one that remained. Here in the high hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains, winter was not a season, but a state of being, a fortress of ice and silence he had built around himself, brick by painful brick. His cabin, a sentinel of dark timber against the endless white, was less a home and more a barracks for one. Every morning the routine was an echo of a former life, a ghost of purpose that kept the deeper shadows at bay. Floorboards groaned under his weight in the pre-dawn chill, a familiar complaint in the otherwise silent structure. Coffee, black and bitter, was brewed with military precision. The wood stove was cleared of ash and reloaded with the same practiced economy of motion he had once used to field strip a rifle in total darkness. This was his mission, now to endure the day. He stood on the porch, the steam from his mug a fleeting ghost in the frigid air, and surveyed his territory. The mountains, clad in ermine snow and granite, were his perimeter. The wind, a low moan through the skeletal arms of oak and hickory, was the only enemy transmission he had to monitor. At 45, Elias bore the topography of his past on his face and in the rigid set of his broad shoulders. His dark hair was surrendering to gray at the temples, a campaign of attrition he did not fight. He had been a Navy SEAL, a man forged in pressure and fire, trained to be an instrument of decisive action. But the man who had survived the infernos of foreign deserts and the crushing black of the deep sea had been undone by the quiet stillness of a hospital room and the screech of tires on a rain-slicked road. Inside the cabin, the past was a managed threat. Sarah's things were not gone, but contained her favorite armchair by the fireplace still held the faint indentation of her form. A hollow he refused to disturb. A faded cashmere scarf, the color of a winter sky, lay folded on the mantelpiece, a relic of a warmth he could no longer feel. He had locked the door to her art studio, containing the vibrant chaos of her canvases and the scent of turpentine in her that still clung to the air. It was a tactical decision. Some sectors were too dangerous to enter. The grief was a living thing, a predator that stalked the edges of his rigid control, and he gave it no quarter. Then there was the other ghost, the one whose loss was tangled up in the grit and cordite of his final mission. Rex, his partner, his shadow. A Belgian Malinois with eyes that held more intelligence and loyalty than most men. Rex had been more than a military working dog. He had been the keeper of Elias's humanity in places where humanity went to die. He had fallen to a sniper's bullet meant for Alias, a final act of duty that had shattered the last load-bearing wall of his soul. In the corner of the main room, a worn leather collar and a frayed rope toy lay beside the cold hearth. They were monuments to a different kind of love. A bond forged not in vows, but in shared danger and silent understanding. Sometimes, in the deepest troughs of the night, Elias thought he could still feel the phantom weight of Rex's head on his knee. The first flakes of the coming blizzard began to drift down from a sky the color of lead. They were scouts for the main force, a promise of deeper isolation. Elias watched them, his jaw tight. He was prepared. The pantry was stocked, the woodpile high. He had everything he needed to withstand the siege. What he was not prepared for was the faint, high-pitched sound that cut through the wind's mournful song. It was a cry, thin and desperate, almost lost in the rising gale. He dismissed it at first, a coyote perhaps. The mountain was full of noises, tricks of the wind against the rock, but his training, the ingrained hypervigilance he could never shed, refused to let it go. It was a signal of distress. It was a call. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, the movements automatic, and grabbed a powerful flashlight, even though the afternoon was merely graying. The cry came again, sharper this time, a needle of sound piercing the thick blanket of the storm. He followed it, moving into the dense woods that bordered his property, his boots crunching a path in the accumulating snow. The wind clawed at him, throwing pellets of ice against his face, a physical assault that he barely registered. His focus was a narrow beam locked onto the sound. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his senses reaching out, parsing the environment for information. The cold was seeping into him, but it was a familiar enemy. He found them in a shallow hollow, a small dugout beneath the exposed roots of a fallen giant of a pine tree. The sight slammed the air from his lungs. A German shepherd, her noble head low, her coat matted with snow and ice. She was painfully thin, her ribs a stark cage beneath her fur, and a dark frozen patch of blood stained the snow near her hind leg. She was shivering violently, not from the cold alone, but from the effort of shielding two tiny puppies huddled against her belly. She lifted her head as he approached, and a low growl rumbled in her chest, a final desperate defense of her young. But there was no strength behind it, only the last ember of a formidable fire. Elias stopped. He held up his empty hands, a gesture he knew the dog would understand. He did not speak, he just watched. Her eyes, the color of rich amber, were clouded with pain and exhaustion, but in their depths, he saw it. The same unwavering, defiant loyalty he had seen in Rex's eyes 1,000 times. She was a warrior, defeated not by an enemy, but by the brutal indifference of the world. One of the puppies, a small, bold male with oversized paws, wriggled free and took a clumsy step toward him, letting out a tiny squeaking bark. The other, a darker female, remained pressed against her mother, a trembling ball of fear. In that moment, something inside Elias cracked. The permafrost that had encased his heart for 2 years fractured under the weight of this raw, undeserved suffering. He was looking at a reflection of his own squadron, a fallen leader, a foolishly brave recruit, and a terrified soul hiding from the world. The mission parameters became instantly clear. Objective, extraction, threat, the storm, the mother's injury, the encroaching hypothermia. He knelt slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The mother dog watched him, her growl fading into a ragged whine. She could not fight him, and some deep animal instinct seemed to recognize that he was not a threat, but a last, desperate hope. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." The words felt foreign on his tongue, an old language he had forgotten how to speak. He shrugged off his heavy coat, the biting wind immediately sinking its teeth into his thermal shirt. He laid the coat on the snow, creating an insulated space. The bold puppy, undeterred by the cold, stumbled over and sniffed at the fleece lining before trying to chew on a zipper. Elias gently scooped him up. The puppy was a featherweight of shivering fur and surprising warmth. He placed him in the center of the coat. Next, he reached for the timid one. She flinched, burying her face deeper into her mother's side. He had to gently pry her loose, her tiny body rigid with fear. As he lifted her, she let out a pitiful cry. The mother's head came up, a flicker of protective fire in her eyes, but she was too weak to move. "It's okay," Elias said softly, his voice a low rumble. "It's okay, Mama." He placed the second puppy beside its brother. Now for the mother. Her leg was clearly broken, the angle unnatural, and she was losing a battle against shock. He couldn't carry her and the coat with the puppies. He needed a litter, but there was no time. The storm was closing in, the world dissolving into a churning vortex of white. He had to move now. He looked back at his cabin, a faint smudge of light in the growing darkness. It was a few hundred yards, but in these conditions, it might as well have been miles. He made a decision. He carefully wrapped the puppies in the coat, creating a warm, secure bundle. He could carry that in one arm. The mother would be the challenge. He approached her again, speaking in that same low, calming tone. "All right, girl, this is going to hurt, but we have to go." He positioned himself, preparing to lift her. As he did, his eyes fell on the faded cashmere scarf on his mantle, a clear image in his mind. Sarah's scarf. It was soft, and it still smelled of her. A sudden, insane impulse seized him. He sprinted back to the cabin, the wind at his back. He burst through the door, the warmth of the stove a shock to his frozen skin. He snatched the scarf from the mantelpiece, the soft wool a jolt of memory in his hand. He ignored the lance of pain in his chest, the protest of the ghosts in the room. He ran back out into the blizzard, the precious scarf clutched in his fist. Back at the hollow, the mother dog had not moved. He gently wrapped the smallest, most frightened puppy in Sarah's scarf, the soft fabric a swaddle of impossible tenderness. He then tucked her inside his shirt, against the warmth of his skin, her tiny, cold body. Stark contrast to the burning grief in his heart. He bundled the bolder puppy back into the coat and slung it over one shoulder. Then, gritting his teeth, he carefully slid his arms under the injured mother. She whimpered, a raw sound of agony that twisted his gut. But she didn't fight him. He lifted. She was heavier than she looked, a dead weight of bone and fur and misery. The journey back was a brutal battle. Every step was a plunge into deep, uncertain snow. The wind screamed in his ears, trying to rip the heat from his body. The weight of the dog was immense, a crushing burden that made his muscles burn and his old injuries sing with fire. The puppy inside his shirt was a fragile, precious secret, its faint heartbeat a drum against his own. He focused on the light from his cabin window, a single, distant star in the swirling chaos. It was his beacon. It was landfall. He finally staggered onto the porch, his lungs heaving, his body shaking with exertion. He shouldered the door open and half fell inside, collapsing onto the rug in front of the fireplace. He gently lowered the mother dog onto the thick bearskin rug, her breathing shallow and ragged. He retrieved the bundled puppy from his coat and placed him next to her. Then, carefully, he unbuttoned his shirt and drew out the tiny female, still wrapped in Sarah's sky-blue scarf. He laid her beside her brother. The two puppies immediately began to nuzzle against their mother, seeking comfort she was too depleted to give. For a long moment, Elias simply knelt there on the floor, the blizzard raging outside, the fire crackling inside, and the quiet, desperate breathing of three rescued creatures filling the silence of his fortress. The sterile order of his life had been breached. Mud and snow and the scent of wet fur now sullied his sanctuary. The walls he had built to keep the world out had been broken, not by force, but by a tide of helpless innocence. He looked at the mother dog's amber eyes, now watching him with a weary, waiting intelligence. He looked at the bold little male, already trying to stand on wobbly legs. He looked at the tiny female, curled into a tight knot of fear, inside the soft wool of his wife's scarf. The ice around his heart did not melt. It shattered. The next hours were a blur of focused activity, a new mission that pushed his grief into the background. First, triage. He was no veterinarian, but he had extensive field medical training. He cleaned the mother's wound as best he could, the gash deep but no longer bleeding heavily. Her leg was the real problem. It would need to be set properly. He improvised a splint using 2 pieces of kindling and strips torn from an old t-shirt, his hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. The dog endured it all with a stoicism that shamed him, her only protest a soft whine when the pain became too much. He brought them water, which the mother lapped at gratefully, and then warmed some broth from his own supplies, which she drank with a desperate hunger. The chaos they brought was a strange sort of balm. The bold puppy, whom he had started to think of as Buddy, quickly recovered his strength. He was a force of nature in miniature, a clumsy agent of disruption. He tumbled over Elias's neatly stacked books, skidded across the polished wood floors, and waged a futile war against the leg of a table. His every action was infused with an absurd, unearned confidence, a belief that the world was a wonderful place designed for his personal amusement. Elias found himself watching the little fool's antics, an unfamiliar twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been the ghost of a smile. The little female was another story. She remained withdrawn, a tiny wisp of a creature who viewed the world from the safety of her mother's side or the folds of Sarah's scarf. She was a shadow and the name stuck in his mind. Shadow. She watched him with wide, frightened eyes that held the same haunted stillness he saw in his own reflection each morning. She was the one who mirrored his own brokenness, his own deep-seated fear that the world was a place of loss and pain. He found himself drawn to her, his protective instincts so long dormant, zeroing in on this smallest, most vulnerable soul. By morning the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a pristine blanket of white. The silence was profound. Inside the cabin, a new kind of quiet had settled. It was not the empty, sterile silence of before, but one filled with the soft sounds of life, the rustle of the puppies, the mother's steady breathing, the thump of Buddy's tail against the floor. Elias felt a shift in the very atmosphere of his home. It was no longer a tomb, it was a recovery ward. He knew he was out of his depth. The mother, whom he had named Sheba for her queenly dignity, needed real medical attention. He used his satellite phone, a device he usually only turned on for his sister Chloe's mandatory weekly check-ins. He didn't call Chloe. He called the only other number he had memorized for this town, the one taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet for emergencies. Martha's General Store. Martha, the town's matriarch, a small, tough woman with eyes that saw far too much. She answered on the second ring. Elias, I was wondering when you'd get snowed in enough to call. Martha, he said, his voice raspy. I need a vet. He explained the situation in clipped, tactical sentences. The discovery, the injury, the puppies. He left out the part about the scarf, the part about the shattering ice in his chest. Martha was silent for a moment when he finished. He could almost hear the gears turning in her wise old head. Dr. Anna Reed, she said finally. She's new in town, good with her hands, better with her heart. Her place is on the old Miller Road, but she won't get through this snow. I'll call her, tell her to expect a visitor. You'll have to bring the dog to her, son. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Getting Sheba into his truck was another ordeal. He constructed a makeshift stretcher from a tarp and 2 poles, and with painstaking care, he moved her. The puppies he placed in a cardboard box on the passenger seat lined with old towels. Shadow trembled the entire time while Buddy tried to climb out, yapping with excitement at the new adventure. The drive into town was slow and treacherous, the snowplows not yet having cleared the secondary roads. The world was a blinding expanse of white and blue. When he finally pulled up to the small clinic with a sign that read, Mountain Paws, Veterinary Care, a woman was already waiting on the porch, bundled in a heavy parka. Dr. Anna Reed was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with kind, intelligent eyes and a calm, competent demeanor. She helped him carry Sheba inside, without a word, her movements efficient and gentle. Let's get her on the table, she said, her voice soft but firm. For the next hour, Elias watched as she worked. She was incredible. She sedated Sheba, cleaned and stitched the wound properly, and set the broken leg in a lightweight cast. She moved with a quiet confidence that reminded Elias of the best combat medics he had ever known. She exuded a sense of peace, a healing aura that seemed to calm not just the animals, but the tense guarded man watching from the corner of the room. She was lucky you found her, Anna said as she checked on the puppies, who were now exploring the warm clinic office. Buddy was attempting to liberate a squeaky toy from a basket, while Shadow hid beneath a desk. Another few hours in that storm, and none of them would have made it. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and searching. That was a good thing you did, Mr. Vance. Elias just nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. It wasn't a good thing. It was a necessary thing. There was a difference. She's severely malnourished, but the puppies are surprisingly healthy. She gave them everything she had. As Anna finished her work, the bell on the clinic door jingled, and Martha walked in, carrying a large, steaming pot. Figured you all could use this, she said, setting the pot on the counter. The rich smell of beef stew filled the air. Martha's gaze took in the scene, the bandaged mother dog resting peacefully, the puppies, the quiet veterinarian, and the hulking, awkward former soldier standing guard. She smiled a small, knowing smile. Looks like your house got a little fuller, Elias? Temporary, he grunted, the word a shield. Just until they're on their feet. But as he said it, he looked at Shadow, still huddled under the desk, and a wave of protectiveness washed over him, so fierce and unexpected it nearly took his breath away. The word felt like a lie. Anna and Martha exchanged a look he couldn't decipher, a silent communication between two women who understood the landscape of the human heart far better than he did. Well, Anna said, wiping her hands on a towel. They'll need to stay here for a day or two for observation, especially Sheba. Then they can go home with you. The 2 days, without them, were unnervingly quiet. The cabin reverted to its former state of silent order, but now the silence felt different. It was hollow, empty. He found himself listening for the sound of Buddy's clumsy scrabbling or looking for Shadow's timid form in the corner. The fortress felt like a prison again. When he returned to the clinic to pick them up, Buddy greeted him with a frenzy of yaps and tail wags, launching himself at Elias's legs. Even Shadow managed a tentative tail wag, her fear warring with a budding sense of recognition and trust. As he loaded them back into his truck, Sheba, now able to limp on her casted leg, Anna placed a hand on his arm. You'll need to bring her back in a week for a checkup, she said, and call me if you need anything. Anything at all. He met her eyes and saw, not pity, but a deep, genuine warmth. He just nodded again, unable to form the words of thanks he felt. The next week was a period of profound transformation. The rigid discipline of Elias's life was systematically dismantled by the happy chaos of 3 dogs. His mornings were no longer his own. They were dictated by the needs of the puppies, their whines for food, and their boundless energy. He found himself on the floor rolling a ball for Buddy, was shocked by the sound of his own low chuckle when the puppy inevitably tripped over his own paws in his excitement. He spent hours just sitting by the fire, coaxing Shadow to take a piece of kibble from his hand. The first time she did it, her soft mouth gentle against his callous skin, it felt like a treaty being signed, a peace accord. He was giving them care, food, and shelter, but they were giving him something far more vital. They were giving him the present. They forced him to exist in the moment, to focus on their immediate needs rather than dwelling on the ghosts of his past. The empty spaces in the cabin began to fill up with them. Buddy claimed the spot by the hearth as his own. Sheba took up a regal position on the bearskin rug from where she could oversee her small kingdom. And Shadow, slowly, tentatively, started to claim a space near Elias's feet, her small, warm body a constant, reassuring presence. One evening, as he sat in his own armchair, reading a book, he felt a small weight on his boot. He looked down. Shadow had fallen asleep there, her head resting on his foot. The trust in that simple act was a weight heavier and more precious than any medal he had ever earned. His carefully constructed armor was falling away, piece by piece. One afternoon he unlocked the door to Sarah's studio. He stood on the threshold, breathing in the scent of her, and felt the familiar wave of grief wash over him. But this time, it was different. It didn't threaten to drown him. He walked over to a half-finished canvas, a vibrant sunset over the mountains, and traced the line of a brushstroke with his finger. Buddy trotted in after him, sniffing curiously at a stack of canvases. Shadow poked her head in, looked at Elias, and then, seeming to take courage from his presence, she followed. He watched them explore the room, their innocence a stark contrast to the deep well of his sorrow. And he realized something profound. The grief was still there, a permanent part of his internal landscape, but it was no longer the only thing there. There was room for something else now. There was room for life. The knock on his door came a week later. It was sharp and official sounding, utterly alien in his quiet world. He opened it to find a man in a county animal control uniform. He was a young man with a serious face and an air of bureaucratic certainty. "Mr. Vance?" he asked, his eyes immediately going past Elias to the dogs in the cabin. "I'm Officer Davis. We received the call from Dr. Reed about some unregistered strays you're housing." Elias's body went rigid. The old instincts, the reflexive suspicion of authority, kicked in. He positioned himself in the doorway, a human barrier. "They're not strays," he said, his voice low and flat. "Sir," Davis said, pulling out a clipboard, "Dr. Reed was just following protocol. Any stray animal, especially one with an injury, has to be reported. They need to be brought to the county shelter for a mandatory 10-day hold. We check for microchips, post their pictures. If they're not claimed, they go up for adoption." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. The shelter, a place of concrete floors and steel cages, a place where a timid, traumatized puppy like Shadow would shatter completely. The possibility that they could be separated, adopted out to different families, or worse. He couldn't even complete the thought. "No," Elias said. The word was a piece of granite. "They're staying here." Officer Davis sighed, a weary sound. "Sir, I understand you've grown attached, but it's the law. It's for their own good. To give a potential owner a chance to find them." "I'm their owner," Elias stated, the words surprising even himself. "They don't have a chip. They don't have a collar. Legally, they're property of the county until they clear the hold period," Davis said, his tone softening slightly. "Look, I can see they're well cared for. You'll be the first on the list to adopt them when the hold is up, I promise. But I have to take them. I can come back tomorrow morning to give you some time to prepare." The ultimatum hung in the air. A ticking clock. The institutional threat he had not anticipated was here, and it was far more dangerous than the blizzard. It was a threat based on rules that had no room for the heart. After Davis left, Elias sank into his chair, the weight of the new threat pressing down on him. Sheba seemed to sense his distress, limping over to rest her head on his knee. Buddy, oblivious, chewed on his rope toy. But Shadow, she felt it too. She crept over and huddled by his leg, trembling. He looked at them, his pack, his squadron. The thought of them in cages, separated and afraid, ignited a cold fire in his belly. He had failed to protect his wife. He had failed to protect Rex. He would not fail them. That night, a new storm began to brew. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry wolf. Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, watching his small family sleep, a fierce, primal sense of possession solidifying within him. They were his. They were his responsibility. His new mission. The storm broke just before dawn, a ferocious onslaught of wind and snow that was even worse than the first. A massive gust of wind hit the side of the cabin, and a heavy pine branch, weighted with ice, cracked and fell against the roof with a deafening crash. The explosive sound sent a shockwave of panic through the cabin. Buddy yelped and scrambled under the table. Sheba let out a startled bark, but Shadow reacted with pure instinctual terror. She shot to her feet, her eyes wide with fear, and bolted. Before Elias could react, she had squeezed through the dog door he had installed, a small flap that led to a fenced-in run. But in the chaos of the past week, he had forgotten to repair a section of the fence that had been damaged by the first storm's snowdrifts. Shadow scrambled through the gap and disappeared into the raging whiteout. "Shadow!" Elias roared, his heart seizing in his chest. He grabbed his coat and flashlight and plunged out into the storm after her. The wind was a solid wall, stealing his breath and blinding him with a torrent of snow. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He followed her tracks, small, desperate prints that were already vanishing under the fresh snowfall. He shouted her name until he was hoarse, the wind snatching the sound and tearing it to shreds. His military training took over. He swept the area in a grid pattern, his mind a cold, calculating machine, but his heart was a frantic drum of fear. She was so small, so fragile. The cold would take her in minutes. The tracks led away from the cabin, away from the safety of the woods, and toward the low, distant rumble of the mountain highway. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his disciplined mind. The highway would be treacherous, the visibility near zero. A driver would never see her. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning, his lungs aching from the frozen air. The old shrapnel wound in his thigh began to throb a familiar ghost of pain. He ignored it. He followed the faint trail, his flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through the swirling snow. He finally saw her, a small dark shape huddled on the shoulder of the highway. The snowplows had been through, creating a high bank of snow, and she was trapped between it and the asphalt. She was frozen in terror, mesmerized by the headlights of an approaching semi-truck that was barreling through the storm, its horn blaring. Time seemed to slow down. The truck, the snow, the terrified puppy, it all coalesced into a single horrific tableau. There was no time to think. There was only action. Elias launched himself forward, a desperate lunging dive. He scooped Shadow into his arms, just as the truck roared past the force of its passage, a physical blow that sent a spray of icy slush over them. He rolled into the snowbank on the far side of the road, shielding the tiny dog with his own body. He lay there for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs, the trembling form of the puppy clutched to his chest. He had made it. He had saved her. A set of flashing blue and red lights cut through the blizzard. A county vehicle pulled to a stop. Officer Davis got out, his face pale with shock. He had evidently decided to come early, to get the unpleasant task over with before the storm got worse, and had witnessed the entire, heart-stopping rescue. He ran over to where Elias was getting to his feet, brushing snow from the shivering puppy. "Vance, are you all right? My God, I saw the whole thing." Elias looked at the young officer, his face a mask of grim determination. He held Shadow tighter. "She was scared," was all he said. Davis looked from the man to the dog in his arms, and something in the officer's by-the-book expression shifted. He saw not a stubborn recluse breaking the rules, but a man who had just risked his own life without a flicker of hesitation for a creature he had known for barely a week. He saw the fierce, protective love of a soldier for his unit. He saw family. "Let's get you home, Mr. Vance," Davis said, his voice quiet with a newfound respect. Back at the cabin, Sheba and Buddy greeted them with frantic relief. Elias set Shadow down, and she immediately ran to her mother. Davis stood in the doorway watching the scene. He took off his hat, running a hand through his damp hair. "The mandatory hold," he said, his voice low. "It's to ensure animals get a chance to be reclaimed, but I think it's pretty clear these dogs have been reclaimed already." He looked at Elias. "I'll file the report. Strays found and fostered. I'll get the paperwork started for you. To adopt them, all of them. We can call it a field adoption. Due to extenuating circumstances." The relief that washed over Elias was so profound it left him weak. He simply nodded at Davis, a silent acknowledgement of the man's kindness, of his choice to see the spirit of the law, rather than just the letter. When the officer left, Elias sank down onto the floor. Sheba came and licked his face. Buddy tumbled into his lap, and Shadow, after a moment's hesitation, crept forward and rested her head on his knee, looking up at him with eyes that were no longer filled with terror, but with an absolute, unwavering trust. In that moment, surrounded by his pack, the rescuer finally understood that he was the one who had truly been saved. The cabin was no longer a fortress, it was a home, filled with warmth and the gentle chaos of life. With Anna's help, the adoptions were made official. His days found a new rhythm, a new purpose. He built a larger, more secure run for the dogs. He took them for long walks in the woods, Sheba's limp slowly fading, Buddy charging ahead, and Shadow trotting faithfully at his heel. He started volunteering at Anna's clinic, his quiet competence and gentle way, with scared animals making him an invaluable asset. He and Anna developed an easy friendship built on shared purpose and quiet understanding. One crisp spring evening, Elias sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the same vibrant colors as Sarah's unfinished canvas. Sheba was dozing at his feet, Buddy was engaged in a heroic struggle with a fallen leaf, and Shadow was curled up in his lap, her head resting over his heart. He felt the familiar pang of grief for Sarah, for Rex, but it was a gentle ache now, not a raw wound. It coexisted with the warmth of the puppy in his lap and the profound peace of the evening. Martha had been right. His house had gotten fuller, so had his heart. He had gone into the storm to rescue 3 desperate creatures, and in the frozen wilderness, he had found his way back to himself. He had a new mission now. It was not to endure the day, but to live it.